and celebration are juxtaposed so closely in our tradition, even to the breadth of a Holy Saturday, between the devastating silence of Good Friday and the joyous Alleluias of Easter Sunday. Of course, everything in our New Testament and our existence as Christians proceeds from Easter. We are an Easter people after all. But it's easy to skip over the burial of Jesus and the mourning that ordinarily would follow an Israelite burial, so as to miss out on just how significant resurrection was for our ancient ancestors in the faith. Over several videos, I want to explore with you the significance of Israelite burial and mourning custom. The purpose will be so as to better appreciate the heart of Easter. Today we'll be looking at the usual process of burial and mourning for first century Israelite elites. The Gospels hint at important ancient burial and mourning practices, quite remote for United States Christians. Consider, what is going on exactly in the various Gospel accounts about Jesus' burial and the women subsequently going to anoint him? Wasn't his corpse inaccessible to these women? It was being held in custody under Roman guard, right? Wasn't it sealed away, therefore, locked behind a stone? Since the Gospels all attest to Jesus' body being treated thus, how could Mary Magdalene, whether alone, as the fourth Gospel reports, or in the company of other women, as the Synoptics say, who disagree with John, ever hope to reach the body of Jesus, much less anoint it? Investigating these questions, diving deep into them, raises many fascinating issues. What about the story of the women going to anoint the dead Jesus is factual or historical? Stage 1 of Gospel development. And what about it was theologically invented, crafted later on, stage 2 and 3 of Gospel development. Also, some pretty heavy theological stuff is getting raised. By interrupting the mourning and burial process, what do the resurrection accounts say about the death of Jesus? Was it right and necessary, in accord with God's will? Or was it wrong, and thus overturned by God? It's going to take several video presentations to explore these questions. First, in order to get there, it is important to understand the meaning of Israelite burial customs and the mourning process of Jesus' day. This has been preserved for us in ample first-century archaeological evidence from Syro-Palestine and subsequent scribal Pharisaic documents. Cultural anthropology and the social sciences will help us sift through and rightly contextualize the data. I'm going to be drawing from the insights and guidance of context scholars Bruce Molina and Richard Rohrbaugh here. We should explain that life for ancient Israelites, all collectivistic, anti-introspective, dyadic personalities, was an existence where everybody lived together. They lived together as a group self, having one group conscience. All were embedded into the most significant family male or patriarch. Therefore, first-century Israelites ordinarily dwelt together in the patriarchal compound. Within that compound were arranged, endogamous, patrilateral first-cousin marriages. Life and marriage was lived patrilocally. And that's how things were for Israelites always. That's how it had always been and would be forever. And I mean forever, as in forever and ever, and don't you dare even think of changing it. This Israelite existence is basically how it was also with all other ancient MENA peoples, that's Middle Eastern North African peoples, and also other ancient Mediterraneans. Even today, this kind of lifestyle remains visible through much of that part of the world. When I say forever and ever, I'm not exaggerating. This cannot be stressed enough to American individualistic Christians who marry exogamous, self-selecting partners and tend to reside with them in neo-local homes. American Christians enjoy making absurd claims that they live in biblical ways and celebrate biblical marriage and how Bible-based their families are. But I got to tell you, friends, they don't really know what they're talking about when they do this. For ancient Israelites and all other Mediterranean peoples, even after death, this embedded dwelling together continued. In first century Israel, everyone got buried together, rotted together, and awaited resurrection together. The domestic religious belief and practice of ancestorism was therefore hugely important to first century Israelites, as it was for all Mediterranean peoples. Unlike Americans, Christian or not, it makes no difference, who understand death as punctiliar. In contrast, ancient Israelites understood death as a lengthy, drawn-out process. So let's now go over what we know about the process to illuminate things about Jesus' death and burial. A word of caution. I mentioned earlier that our sources will be archaeological finds and scribal notes. Please keep in mind that no more than 2% of the total population of Herodian Syro-Palestine could read or write. Consequently, I should point out that the gospel writers belonged to and were sympathetic of the urban elite because they were literate. And since like writes about like, whenever anybody writes, they write about what they know. Since ancient Israelite authors were elites, then they must have had elite concerns, and these are readily discoverable in their writings. But what happens if they should write about a peasant or nothing person like the Galilean artisan Jesus? Please be aware that these authors, being far removed from the socioeconomic conditions of the Galilee, necessarily were perceiving things by looking over an uncrossable social divide, a chasm of extreme differences and experiences. This seldom discussed yet crucially important aspect of New Testament analysis applies very much to the evangelists we call Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Being literate, their experience was far removed from the Galilee of Jesus and its illiterate and starving peasantry. So, with that understood, we will now describe burial practices for elite circles in Judea. Just keep in mind that we are not talking about the non-urban poor like Galilean peasant day laborer Jesus. Nor are we talking about what happens to a body of a condemned criminal. But don't worry, we'll get there. Imagine a first-century Jerusalem elite has died. Sometime between his final breath and sundown, slaves, overseen by significant family members, would lay out his body on a shelf or slab within the family tomb. Outside Jerusalem, artisans and day laborers had long before carved this tomb from the abundant limestone bedrock of the surround. The mourning process began. First on the agenda was the lengthy funeral. Even far from the gravesite, professional mourners could be heard, wailing and weeping, displaying the family honor to all around. Musicians would play instruments employed to induce altered states of consciousness, readily experienced at gravesites for millennia by Mediterranean personalities. Most Mediterraneans in the first century, even most elites, did not hold to what Plato and Aristotle believed about death, or about souls separating from bodies at the moment of death. Biblical peoples almost always did not think of themselves as souls that inhabited a body. They didn't think they had a body. Rather, they commonly understood that they were a body. In other words, for most Israelites, to be human was to be an animated body rather than an incarnated soul. Therefore, the etymology of the earthy Adam, essentially a bodily creature, is crucial in regarding how Israelites saw being human. After 4 days, most Israelites believed the life force of a dead person, more shadowy breath and soul, had left. Even still after this, female kinfolk continued sitting on the floor for at least a month, mourning. Indeed, throughout the whole year following the deceased person's last breath, mourning continued, as the body, sealed behind stone, decomposed. Often at wakes, Americans look down at the arranged, beloved figure in the coffin, a bloodless, organless facade drenched in preserving chemicals, and make comments like, well, at least she's not suffering anymore. Sentiments like these were most alien to the ancient Israelite mourning experience. In extreme contrast, our biblical ancestors believed that the snail's pace process of flesh rotting away was agonizingly painful. For the Israelite, feeling does not end with the last breath. It goes on through decomposition. However, they also considered this painful decomposition process to be expiatory of sins, acts that shamed or dishonored God. Our ancient Israelite ancestors imagined that a dead Israelite's evil acts were somehow embedded into his or her flesh. Therefore, they thought, as the flesh excruciatingly dissolved, so too the sins of the deceased also dissolved. Hence, Israelite mourning was a suffering in solidarity with the dead. Anointing a corpse with perfumes and rubbing salves and aloes on the body were meant to soothe the horrible pangs for a helpless sufferer undergoing the transition of decay. In the first days following the final breath, spending time close to the tomb was meant to help ease this torturous transformation for the deceased elite. This kind of mourning was the very best thing an elite could do for his or her deceased kin. Now consider, if the gospel writers, themselves elites, spent time writing about the dead Jesus being anointed, especially with costly oils and perfumes, do you think this reflects the experience of Galilean peasant villages, or the elite who lived in the Mediterranean polis? And does it reflect stage 1 of gospel formation, or stage 3? Once a year had passed, the mourning ritual concluded. By this point, all that would remain in the linen burial cloth would be dusty bones. These bones were important, sacred even. This was because first-century Israelites believed that the bones of a dead person held his or her personality and were essential for resurrection, by which God turns a human being into a star. The Pharisaic belief was that when the God of Israel eventually came to raise the dead person at resurrection day, his or her bones would be used as a support structure or scaffolding for a new sky vault flesh. Because of this Pharisaic hope, after 1 year of mourning, the tomb would be opened up, and a key process called oscillegium, or the collection of bones, would commence. Following 1 year of purification from sin in the putrefaction of flesh, the bones of the elite dead were collected and placed into a bone box called an ossuary. This was a second burial into a second casket. Rohrbaugh and Molina explained that the ossuary was designed to resemble a box for scrolls. The ossuary had to be just long enough to hold the femurs, the longest and strongest bones of the human body. These thigh bones got laid in like scroll spindles. There they would be kept safe until God gave them new sky vault flesh and a new inscription on resurrection day. We should note that the practice of oscillegium was so widespread in Israel that, despite its associations with resurrection, even high-ranking Sadducees, like Caiaphas the high priest, had ornate ossuaries. Please take careful note of all this writing symbolism associated with the ossuary and second burial. Again, recall that only 2% of ancient Israelites could read and write. Therefore consider, from what sector of the society does this burial symbolism associated with scrolls and new inscriptions originate? Did it come from the illiterate Galilean poor, or from the elite urban population? I ought to mention that besides tools for writing, there was also another image and symbolism associated with femurs and the ossuary, more befitting a lowly social status. Some Israelites regarded the thigh bones as loom posts, with which God, seen as a weaver, would fashion and spin out a new sky vault body. Should it be surprising, then, given all this writing symbolism and weaving symbolism tied up with resurrection, that archaeologists have uncovered many inkwells and spindle whorls inside the excavated tombs? After a year of mourning came the second burial, which was a happy day. This day marked the end of the racking pains of the rotting deceased and the finality to the family's mourning process. On that day, the family turned toward the hope of family reunion and resurrection. But now imagine what would happen if somehow, at any point over this long process, the body vanished. Although difficult for American Christians to imagine it, to lose a body following death would be far more horrific than the death itself for an ancient Israelite. This may give us some insight as to what Mary Magdalene was emotionally going through in John chapter 20. This is a horror show, another biblical tale of terror. Because if you don't have those bones, how can you prepare them for resurrection? All Israelites would understand this terrifying predicament. Soon we will explore more on this topic and how the resurrection of Jesus interrupted the mourning process in a most surprising and extraordinary way. We will also look into how it affects the question of whether Jesus' death was wrong, against the will of God, or right and necessary.